Today's lesson is on the Mongols and their use of the Silk Road to help expand the territory under their control. Our key understanding for this lesson is that beginning around 1200, the Mongols were able to form an extensive and unified state that facilitated the expansion of commerce and the exchange of technology and culture despite their unusual status as a pastoral society. Let's begin with exploring the foundation of the Silk Roads. Now, these were a series of ancient trade routes first established in the 2nd century BCE, which stretched from the Chinese Empire, where they originated, all the way to the Mediterranean basin. Historians estimate that the main road stretched about 4,000 miles. Originally, China's main luxury product, silk, was exchanged at points along these routes, which is how the road got its name. Over time, though, the exchange in goods went both ways, with East and South Asian luxuries like silk, porcelain, and spices making their way westward, and the goods of the Mediterranean basin, such as olive oil and coffee, making their way eastward. Along with commercial goods, ideas also traveled along the Silk Roads. Buddhist monks traveled along the Silk Roads as they proselytized across East Asia. Muslim merchants who traveled the Silk Road spread Islam as well. Moreover, technological innovations traveled along the Silk Roads too. The Chinese magnetic compass made its way to the Middle East, and the astrolabe, another invention in navigation, made its way to East Asia. Any commercial goods transported overland over the Silk Roads required a caravan of animals, as well as merchants and animal keepers, to maintain that caravan. The caravan would have included animals like horses, donkeys, and especially camels to travel over the sands of much of the Middle East. Those people willing to risk their lives to travel such far distances obviously determined that the risk of such a journey was worth the possibility of attaining great wealth. This means that the goods exchanged along the Silk Road were likely not mundane or everyday goods like wheat or plain cloth, but rather what we call luxury goods, the goods that you could only get from specific places, goods that were expensive. Over time, various states in the Middle East constructed large roadside inns along the Silk Roads where caravans could be housed for a few days or longer. Built of stone and including stables for the animals, these caravanserai also facilitated interaction between merchants as they traveled along the Silk Road. Pilgrims, people who traveled to visit specific holy places for religious reasons, could also use the caravanserai. So the Silk Roads connected many of the Asian empires that we've already studied in class. In fact, in history so far, we've been studying the history of settled or sedentary peoples, but it's important to acknowledge that nomadic pastoral societies did exist during this time. Nomadic pastoralists, or people whose main economic activity is raising domesticated animals, didn't live in settled cities or towns, but rather traveled from grassland to grassland to facilitate feeding their herds. In Eurasia, most pastoral groups lived in the Central Asian steppes to the north and west of the Chinese Empire. One of the nomadic pastoralist people from the Asian steppe, the Mongols, were organized into kinship clans. These clans often sought alliances with one another. A clan leader, a Khan, could establish a unified state called a Khanate by expanding his alliances into a confederation or by defeating rival clans. Khanates were consolidated primarily through political marriage. The victors married women from the allied or conquered clans, and sometimes warriors from the allied or conquered clan were married off to women from the victorious clan. Polygamy, especially among the Mongolian nobility, was common. Mongolian society, despite being patriarchal, still granted women a variety of rights. For example, it was women who were responsible for child-rearing and maintaining the clan's livestock, its way of life. Some women were also warriors. One noble princess, Kutulun, was known for defeating men in wrestling matches. Women could also own property and initiate divorce, and noble women in particular could play political roles within the Mongolian state. The Mongols developed a fierce warrior culture. They regularly raided into the northern Chinese Empire, seeking the luxury goods that were otherwise difficult for them to find. Mongol archers in particular were well known because of their ability to aim their arrows accurately even while riding their horses at full gallop. Mongolian warriors were extremely mobile. Each warrior kept many horses and would replace tired horses with fresh ones as they waged war or moved their camps. In this way, Mongol armies could travel up to 70 miles a day. Mongol horses, like the Mongol warriors themselves, wore a thick leather armor in a style borrowed from what the Chinese soldiers wore. And, like Chinese soldiers, Mongol warriors also wore tightly woven silk undergarments which could help stop an arrow from piercing the skin. In fact, it turns out that heavy and tightly woven silk is such fantastic military protection that, in the 20th century, Kevlar fabric, a synthetic silk product, was introduced to help protect first responders from injury. In the late 12th century, in the 1100s, various Mongol clans began expanding, taking over farming villages because they wanted control of richer agricultural areas. They also began taking over larger towns, in part because these urban areas had more wealth that the Mongols could extract through tribute, and because the towns often served as commercial centers, through which Mongols could acquire a variety of manufactured goods, such as the iron, bridles, and stirrups that they depended on for riding their horses. The Mongols recognized the wealth of trade that occurred along the Silk Road, and so they began to expand their states along the caravan routes of the Silk Road. Initially, the Mongols were seen as an enormous threat to Eurasian trade from China to the Middle East. What merchant would possibly want to risk being held up by a Mongol army? The Mongols became politically unified at the beginning of the 13th century when one Khan, Temujin, sought to unify all the Mongol clans into a single khanate. He defeated his rivals one at a time, gaining a reputation for mercilessness, and in 1206 he accepted the title of Genghis Khan, or Universal Ruler of the Mongols. Genghis Khan spent the next 2 decades conquering much of Asia. He tried to conquer China, but by 1215 had shifted his focus instead to the Muslim regions west of Mongolia. In just 7 years, he controlled all of Central Asia. Of course, Genghis had all the qualities needed in a great leader for the Mongols. He was a great organizer and military strategist. He was open to new ideas, especially new ideas dealing with military technology. And he was willing to use cruelty as a weapon. His armies, made up of horsemen who were literally raised in the saddle, had a great advantage over other cavalry. In addition to the bows and arrows that they used, the pikes and the swords and the shields, they also used trebuchets, which they had adopted from the Persians, and gunpowder, which they had picked up from the Chinese. The Mongols would combine these 2 weapons and fire explosive shells from their trebuchets. Genghis Khan also believed in rewarding good soldiers, and he promoted generals based on merit, which earned him the loyalty of his troops. And of course, he used traditional Mongolian diplomacy, political marriage, to consolidate his rule. By some accounts, Genghis Khan married more than 500 women, although many of these marriages were likely platonic. Current genetic research indicates, though, that Genghis Khan's haplotype, the Y chromosome indicators, spread quite rapidly at a pace with the spread of his empire, so much so that as many as 10% of the males who currently live within the borders of what had been the Mongolian Empire are direct descendants of Genghis Khan himself. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, his successors continued the expansion of his empire. For instance, in early 1258, one of Genghis Khan's grandsons besieged the city of Baghdad and sacked it, bringing about the end of the Abbasid Caliphate. By 1260, this empire stretched from China to Poland. Of course, such an enormous empire was difficult to control, so by 1260, Genghis Khan's descendants had divided their empire into 4 khanates, each one ruled by a descendant of Genghis Khan's. All 4 were under the rule of the Great Khan. The benefit of uniting so much of Eurasia under one government was the imposition of stability and order over much of Eurasia. The era of peace and prosperity that followed the creation of the Eurasian Mongol Khanates is known as the Pax Mongolica, or the Mongol Peace, which lasted for about 100 years from the middle of the 13th century until the middle of the 14th century. The Pax Mongolica allowed for the expansion of trade along the Silk Road. The Mongol state specifically protected merchants along those caravan routes. The Mongols also imposed a legal and military system known as LASA. Established by Genghis Khan himself, this code challenged multiple traditional practices across Mongol-controlled Eurasia. For instance, LASA de-emphasized traditional social structures like ethnic or racial divisions and instead focused on establishing a meritocracy within the Mongolian Empire. Additionally, since the Mongols felt that belief systems were a personal matter, Genghis Khan encouraged religious tolerance throughout his empire. According to court records, Genghis Khan consulted with practitioners from many belief systems. Buddhist monks, Muslim and Christian missionaries, even Taoist monks sometimes served as his advisors. While Lhasa emphasized the equality of those living within the Mongolian Empire, some important religious leaders, as well as teachers and doctors, were granted tax-exempt status because their jobs were seen as more important than others. Lhasa also regulated the YAM system, a combination postal and messenger system comprising almost 12,000 kilometers of roadways and rest areas. Some were caravanserai. The YAM system allowed the Khans to send messages quickly along the roads. A messenger could ride a horse between 20 and 40 miles, stop at a station, and either exchange the horse for a fresh one or hand the message over to a new messenger who had a fresh horse. In this way, messages came across the Mongolian Empire very, very quickly. In settling down to govern their new territories, many Mongol leaders began adopting local customs and traditions and therefore blended in with the native peoples. For instance, Mongol leaders of the Il Khanate, what had been the Abbasid Caliphate, converted to Islam. In 1240, Batu Khan, one of Genghis Khan's many grandsons, attacked and demolished the city of Kiev in Eastern Europe, taking over the Russian state. For the next 200 years, much of what is today the state of Russia would be under direct Mongol control. This part of the Mongol Empire was known as the Khanate of the Golden Horde because of the color of the Mongol royalty, gold, and the name of their camps, Horde. As with other areas under Mongol control, Russian nobles were allowed to continue to have their titles and their lands as long as they paid tribute to the Mongols. This also allowed the Russian people to maintain their traditional practices, such as the practice of Christianity. The Mongolian YAM system was particularly helpful throughout the Golden Horde because Russia did not have many urban areas, so the Mongols had to create road systems and stations, and these continued to be used for centuries, even after the Golden Horde collapsed. Mongol rule over Russia isolated Russians from the rest of Europe. As the most important Mongol area was in southern Russia, centered around Kiev, which is now in Ukraine, many Russians moved further north to the area around the city of Moscow. And while Moscow was still a tributary state to the Golden Horde, it was far from the center of Mongol power, and thus Moscow's Russian leaders were able to begin consolidating their own power. In 1260, Kublai Khan, yet another grandson of Genghis Khan's, became the Great Khan. He was focused on extending his personal Khanate into Song Dynasty China. In 1279, Kublai Khan's armies overwhelmed the Song Dynasty, taking over China and founding the Yuan or Mongol dynasty. So Kublai Khan unified China for the first time in 300 years. He maintained a summer palace at Xanadu near the border between Mongolia and China, and he built a brand new capital, Dadu, on the site of modern-day Beijing. As was very typical of Mongol leaders, he left things in place, simply putting Mongols up at the top. So China's bureaucracy, staffed with Confucian scholars, remained in place. Happy with his successful conquest of China, Kublai Khan tried to conquer Japan as well, using Korean natives to launch these attacks. The first invasion failed. The second invasion in 1281 was much larger, made up of 150,000 warriors. It was the largest seaborne invasion in history until the Allied invasion of Normandy Beach in 1944. And yet, the Japanese managed to repel this second invasion as well, largely because of the kamikaze, or the great wind, in essence, a hurricane or a typhoon that blew up and crashed the Mongol ships along the shore. All the Japanese warriors had to do was run to the beaches and kill the Mongol warriors who were swimming to shore. It was also during Kublai Khan's reign that a Venetian merchant known to history as Marco Polo traveled to the Far East with his father and uncle. According to the stories left by Marco Polo, he was sent on a variety of missions for Kublai Khan, and thus he had the opportunity to travel widely throughout the Yuan dynasty. The stories left by Marco Polo were published after his death, and not by Marco Polo but by his cellmate. He was in jail for a while, and these tales became a bestseller. But most of the people of Europe were convinced that his travel was all a work of fiction. Genghis Khan had managed to establish an enormous territorial empire whose influence was felt throughout Eurasia. But its division into the four khanates in 1260 meant that the later histories of these states were somewhat different. As the Mongol Khans settled down, they adapted and adopted the traditional practices of the people native to those areas. And so the general commitment to Yasa eroded, and the principles that had once united the khanates began to fall apart by the middle of the 14th century. For instance, in the Great Khanate, cracks had already begun to appear in the Yuan dynasty toward the end of Kublai Khan's reign. As might be expected by a Mongol leader, Kublai Khan had tolerated all religious traditions. His tolerance had allowed for Buddhism to make a return to China. Islam and Christianity also spread along the southern coast. The expansion of these foreign belief systems greatly worried the scholars who still ran the Chinese bureaucracy, and increasingly, these Neo-Confucianists began to challenge the Yuan dynasty's practices. Also, war losses like the unsuccessful attempts to conquer Japan, as well as extravagant government spending, like the money used to establish new capitals, and the general resentment of the native Chinese people against the Mongols contributed to general political and social instability. When Kublai Khan died in 1294, his successors were unable to solve these continuing problems. Scholars wondered out loud if the Yuan dynasty had already lost the mandate of heaven. During the early part of the 14th century, Kublai Khan's sons and grandsons fought amongst themselves for control of the throne. Their preoccupation allowed various Chinese noble families to begin rebellions along China's borderlands. As might be expected, in 1368, the Yuan dynasty was eventually overthrown by one of these Chinese noble families, who founded the Ming dynasty, which would control China from 1368 to 1644. Now, the Khanates of Central and Western Asia chugged along for a time, but the old unity of the Mongol Empire was fractured after the 1360s. In 1370, a new Mongol clan led by Timur, also known as Tamerlane, began expanding out of the Mongolian homeland. Timur's goal was to recreate Genghis Khan's great empire. But Timur wasn't from a royal Mongolian family. In fact, his family reflected the earlier integration of the Mongol Empire. Timur was part Turkish and he was Muslim. Timur saw himself as both a Muslim ruler, a caliph, and as a Mongol ruler. However, since Timur had only married into Genghis Khan's family, he refused to call himself a Khan. Instead, he picked the Arabic title Amir, meaning monarch or high-ranking leader. Timur also called himself the Sword of Islam as, in the 1380s, he began to expand his territory to incorporate the old Khanates in Central and Western Asia. Since so many of the areas he was conquering included Muslim populations, Timur emphasized his Muslim beliefs when consolidating these territories. At other times, such as when dealing with Mongol families, he emphasized his Mongol heritage. As Genghis Khan had done, Timur left cities which surrendered to him largely alone, as long as they continued to pay the tribute that they had already been accustomed to paying. However, cities which resisted conquest or which revolted after conquest were treated very harshly. In Isfahan, one of the major cities of Persia, Timur ordered the massacre of the city's inhabitants after the city leaders killed Timur's tax collectors and soldiers. It's estimated that the massacre killed between 100 and 200,000 of Isfahan's inhabitants. It's pretty clear that, like Genghis Khan, Timur was willing to use fear and terror to get what he wanted. He was a brilliant military strategist, and while he inspired terror in those who went against him, he inspired loyalty in his troops because of his commitment to promote via merit. Timur also took the time to learn the major languages of the peoples he conquered. Besides his native Turkic, he learned both Persian and various Mongolian dialects. By 1385, Timur had nearly captured all of Persia, but he faced a great challenge from the Khan of the Golden Horde, whom he'd actually helped gain power in Russia. Angered by what he viewed as a betrayal, Timur led his army north into Russia, and he destroyed the capital of the Golden Horde, killed the Khan, and pretty much massacred the Golden Horde's army in the process. Timur was largely uninterested in extending his control over Russia. So, in the aftermath of the collapse of the Golden Horde, Russian nobles based in Moscow would begin to assert their authority and establish truly a Russian state. The empire that Timur created is called the Timurid Empire. It would last from 1370, when he first began to extend his authority over the Mongols, until 1507, although in a much smaller territory than the one he initially created. So while his empire would collapse about 150 years after he established it, one of his descendants, Babur, would actually go on to found a new and longer-lasting empire in South Asia. This one would be known as the Mughal Empire. And so we have the Mongols. They were derided as a barbarian people because of their nomadic pastoral lifestyle and their warrior culture, but turns out that these Mongols exhibited many of the qualities that we, as modern Western people, admire. They were tolerant of different ethnicities and religions. They founded a secular legal code that maintained equality for all the subjects, and they brought about a period of unprecedented peace which facilitated the exchange of trade and ideas across an enormous territory. So it turns out that, in many ways, the Mongols were the exception to all sorts of rules between 1200 and 1400. In other words, the Mongols were awesome.